much for being here. I have a few formal stuff that I have to say. I'm an academic, very boring people at the end of the day. But thank you so much. I actually am very humbled to be sitting here with you all. I was walking and it was just such a humbling experience. It has a certain energy to it that I absolutely love and I haven't experienced in Montreal, so thank you. I'm sure that you all know that people at Columbia, other universities at the United States, and students here, the energy, the passion, and the goodwill that you all have, it has become so contagious and has given courage to many of us in academia to speak up, to break the silence and talk about what we know. I'm sure you're aware of the magnitude of the work that you're doing. I hope you are. But I'm also sure that you will be even more aware of how your work forever changed the landscape of talking about occupation within North American universities. I think you'll get to know it as you go towards the master's degree and the PhD, like what did we do and how amazing it was. I know I don't speak only for myself when I say, I hope I don't lose the lines here, that I'm super thankful that you exist in this world. Thank you for being in this world. There were a sign at McGill Encampment that it said, "Here we carry a new world in our hearts." Now I'm really often quite suspicious about mottos and slogans, but it couldn't be more true. Your heart, combined with knowledge of the world and its injustices, are helping to literally create new landscapes about talking about injustices in universities. Again, I'm grateful, pretty energized about your knowledge and how you care to turn that knowledge into a more just world. Now, before I start, and instead of the rather superficial acknowledgement that we're standing on occupied territories, I want to be very specific and thank from the bottom of my heart to the people in the Mohawk Council because of their decision regarding the student encampment at McGill. What an amazing sign of anti-colonial solidarity at a critical point. There's so much to learn about the awareness of the patterns of struggle from the many nations whose lands we're standing on, particularly the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I want to emphasize, at least here for this teach-in, that I will stand as a listener, always as a listener, and a student to this council, and can't wait to hear more from them. I really think we should have conversations with them to see what went behind, but underneath the decisions that they did. It was amazing. I also want to thank a few very knowledgeable people. All of these, you'll realize at the end why I'm doing this. Because one thing that these past months have taught me is how knowledge and good research can create turns in conversation in favor of the people who are struggling. I want to thank the Jewish Voice for Peace Collective. They've been carrying a new world in their hearts for a long time. Despite the horrible smears and the harassments, I would also like to thank Ireland, and particularly Claire Daly. I don't know if you know Claire Daly. Do you know Claire Daly? No? Look her up. She's amazing. Who's teaching us the art of good argumentation in favor of a more just world. I also want to thank Dr. Norman Finkelstein and Dr. Ilan Pape. The presence of good thinking and powerful arguments about occupation in their work in favor of the liberation of the occupied is beyond amazing, extremely educative. I'm very thankful to them. Saving the best for last, I would also like to thank the South African envoy at the ICC. Let's not forget the hope that they made alive in us by using their amazing competence and their imagination and the history of their struggles in order to allow us to speak up and not dread the heavy smearing that goes on in North American academia. What a turning point that day was. I don't know if you remember the day that they said we're taking Israel to court. And I'm beyond thankful again, and stand as a learner in front of the whole crew of them. I think we should never forget the role that they played in enabling us to speak up by using their precious knowledge of past struggles. Also, thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here. It was because of you and this teach-in that I forced myself to learn more about the fallacies that I'm going to tell you and talk to you about that shape the scenery of discussions about Israel and Palestine. That's why these teach-ins are called public philosophical engagements instead of public talks, because there's reciprocity in them. So I hope I learn as much as you, and I'm sure I will learn more than you. Okay, so I've been strategically pointing out so far that what has helped us see the patterns of injustice and has helped us talk about them is good knowledge. I keep saying that person is knowledgeable, that person is knowledgeable, that person is knowledgeable. You noticed, right? I thanked a lot of people that used their knowledge throughout the process. A type of knowledge that calls out erroneous thinking and is not scared to do so. And in so doing, it literally helps liberate a group of people that have been held hostage due to the insincere reasonings and vicious systems of knowing. So for me, what lies at the heart of this chain of, liberation, be it the Mohawk Council, Dr. Finkelstein, Dr. Ilan Pape, South African envoy, and the amazing anti-Zionist Jewish activists, what is common is good knowledge, I think. More than passion, it's good knowledge. Despite the fact that saying it out loud can have you fired, it can make you go through smears, and can ruin your reputation as a scholar. I have been through that, and I'm still suffering from it, so it's not fun. But good arguments, we need them for a better world. Okay, so I want to talk about also the last thing that I will talk before going to handing out these, is that I want to point to something that perhaps is not discussed as much as it should be, but universities and places of learning should be also considered sacred for these very teachings and for these activities, because we have to become discomforted by being taught. Let's not forget, besides the theft of land, the genocide, the starvation, the rationing of water, and much more, colonial forces have partaken in an 8-month process that can be labeled as nothing but a systemic underdevelopment of Gaza. It's a typical colonial move, this underdevelopment, where you ruin universities, you ruin hospitals, schools, but most importantly for our purposes, you ruin universities. So you undo the development that has gone through. I want to pay tribute to all the irreplaceable professors, doctors, surgeons, and students that Gaza has lost in this colonial process. I want to also bring to our attention that underdeveloping an occupied land, when you become aware that the idea of underdeveloping an occupied land is a classical colonial move, hopefully this should put more responsibility on our shoulders to be vigilant and participatory about the reconstruction and rebuilding of centers of education, science, and knowledge in Gaza. So be on the watch for that and make sure you participate in whatever way you can. It's a huge privilege to have a place to sit, to learn, and not to be afraid of bombs falling on our heads. As people coming from war-torn areas, we have experienced that firsthand. And with privilege, as they say, comes responsibility. One of the questions that I wanted us to think together was the question of tactics in protests. Oftentimes, it gets really frustrating, either in the protests or the discussions about the conflicts. What I really don't like is the amount of insincere reasoning that is there. It is in fact so dominant that it becomes discouraging. But when you look at it, the whole scenery of the West defending Israel is based on this dishonest reasoning. So what is the problem here? What do I mean? You have on the one hand protesters. They have knowledge of colonial patterns, just like we were talking about before. You have the facts, you see social media posts, and you all know very well that Gaza and other Palestinian territories are suffering from the effects of what can be called a settler colonialism. So these are facts. You know them, right? So you're protesting. In other words, it kind of looks as if we've gone back in time and we're witnesses to the occupation of this land, the one that we're sitting on right now. As always, as I always say, we're kind of seeing live colonialism, right? So you're protesting live colonialism, but on the other hand, there are very powerful but quite invisible presumptions and premises that make the climate of talking about Palestine really foggy. Sometimes it makes you decide to not engage at all. You decide to go to your own circles, and eventually you decide to show your protest through encampments, because it seems like politicians and the media do not want to listen, right? So this is the problem that we have. It's like we're in two different worlds of reasoning. One world is based on facts, familiar colonial patterns, obvious mass suffering, and the other one is based on what Ilan Pape calls myths, as well as what I call logical fallacies. So what happens when a provocateur approaches you? When they approach you, a provocateur in a protest, they're coming at you from a parallel world, from the world of fallacies. They're not coming from the world of reasoning, right? It's like two different worlds. But here lies the problem. You cannot counteract a fallacious reasoning by bringing facts. You cannot say, you have seen in the altercations, it doesn't work that way. They're not meant to create conversations, right? At least you cannot do it immediately. What do I mean by this is that the minute, someone says, you are spreading hatred towards the Jews, it's a logical fallacy, it's appeal to emotions, it's a very common one. The fallacy, it can be other fallacies as well, but the problem with logical fallacies is that it will take you at least 10 minutes if you want to talk about this and debunk this in the middle of all the chaos of the protest, to unpack it and counter it. Now, the provocateurs are very aware of this mechanism. They know that they're coming at you not with reasoning. It's precisely why they employ these rhetorical moves and fallacious reasonings. Fallacies are there to gaslight you and disarm you from your justice-oriented approach. In so doing, there is a momentary victory, right? In that moment, they win when they're filming. Now, these momentary victories add up, unfortunately. They accumulate, and they make the whole scenery of the conversations in the public domain. Every time you want to counter one argument, there is another fallacy that shows up. It becomes exhausting, and it requires a lot of knowledge to unpack each of them. This is a tactic of people who want to have power, despite not having the justification or legitimacy for it. So they don't have the legitimacy for the power, but they want to have power. What they do, they resort to fallacies. It's a very old trick. It goes back to the ancient Greece. Right? A pity that universities don't focus on fallacies this way. So my suggestion, in line with what I mentioned earlier about our responsibility towards our own knowledge, to be rigorous, reflective, dynamic, and forever in a learning state, if we want to be good allies, is to become aware of at least some of the, 5 of the major fallacies that have shaped the conversations and discussions and the scenery of discussions about Israel and Palestine. Because unfortunately, one of the main, and I would say one of the major tools of colonial reasoning here is Zionism, is using fallacies to remain alive. As I mentioned, unpacking fallacies are exhausting and almost impossible in quick conversations. So chances are that fallacious reasoning always wins, right? But there's a way around this. If you can identify the type of fallacy, instead of ignoring, disengaging, and trying to reason, you can actually change the dynamic of conversation by calling out the dishonest reasoning. So instead of reasoning, you just identify the fallacy. And this way you will disarm the dishonest reasoning. Just by saying the name of the hypocritical reasoning, you actually do. It helps a lot to progress in what you want. It will take a little bit of effort. Sometimes, I don't know all the names of the fallacies. I always get confused. I say, what was this one? What was that one? That's not the point. The point is to make sure you know the 5 major ones and to use them in favor of the silenced, people that are being constantly silenced with them. They are difficult for sometimes and very confusing, but they also help you become decolonial activists. So there is a plus in learning at least 5 of them. Fallacies, I want you to note that they're different from myths. And this teaching, I'm not going to talk about the myths about Israel. These are very important discussions about myths that has distorted realities, that have sustained injustices, but I'm going to talk about fallacies here. So I want to go over a few fallacies that are constantly present in the sphere of discussions about Israeli occupation. And I want to wholeheartedly thank Eliora, I don't know her last name or their last name, a Jewish peace activist, who has done research on 6 of these fallacies and has provided this handout on medium.com, and I have it here. So and I'm going to give it to you. It's a valuable resource, and it also provides very interesting information about Israeli peace activists, especially a group called Women in Black. I didn't know they existed. They're a leftist group in Israel. I'm going to read on them for sure more, but now I want to give the 6 fallacies here, and I want you to read them, see if you can understand them, or sort of we can go together over them. So let's take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. Okay, so what I will do is I'll give one to you.
Can we read it in English or in French?
Whatever you want. If you're better, you can read it together now, and then we're gonna get together after. There you go. Thank you. evicting people from their homes or destroying them, protecting killings with silence, and rationing water, right? As with all situations of oppression, we need to stop with the false equivalency in conversation. You cannot say, but also see our side and the danger we are in. In the situation of power imbalance, pointing out to a Palestinian's place on an Israeli or US terrorist list has very little value when those in power get to decide who is a terrorist. You know, you would not go spend a wedding or a weekend in Tel Aviv, I think that's what it's named, like TLV, if you felt imminent danger there. This does not negate the genuine fear your relatives like mine experience. This is, she's Jewish herself, yes, and she has relatives in Israel. When they hear rockets over their head or run for shelter in a bunker. There you go. Thank you. So whenever someone says there are two sides, you say, do not appeal to the false equivalency. This is a false equivalency fallacy, since it's comparing two nations whose statuses and presence are incomparable. So instead of going with facts, bringing it up all the time, if a provocateur says this, it's a very interesting way to actually make them think as well. Because sometimes I think they need good thinking. They might not have been exposed to it, right? So once they do, who knows? Maybe they, you can see wonders if someone pauses their thinking for a second. Second one is the fallacy of specificity. Tell me what it was.
It was like equating any critic of Israel to anti-Semitism.
Yes, such a necessary and important thing. This anti-Semitism is a very specific word. You cannot apply this you cannot conflate it and generalize it. This is a fallacy of perfection, right? It says ad hominem. It's an ad hominem fallacy, which I think could be something else, but yes, it's a specificity problem where you would say anti-Semitism is a very particular crime or thought. Anti-Semitism, I need to mention, is very real, has caused enormous harm, but it's also a very specific word that means having negative feelings towards a community. Suggesting that they're the same shuts down the debate, as the author rightly mentions it. And I also would say confuses us about the real anti-Semitism. So I also think that the victims here would eventually end up being Jewish people, because you are overusing it to the point that people will lose sensitivity over this as well. So this is a specificity fallacy. Good. Number 3 is one of my favorites, because it happened to me a lot. I got mansplained by a Zionist. Imagine like both of them together. And it was the over-intellectualization problem. So tell me what it was. Good. I'll stop you there because I wanna because it's long, and I feel that one you can get lost in it, but it's very simple. If you should call a spade a spade. When there is an over-intellectualization done, if it says it's complicated, it's an appeal to ignorance, and it is, what kind of fallacy does she put it under? Perfection fallacy. Or sometimes they shut you down by saying you don't know the complexity, and this is appeal to ignorance, where you're like, it's complicated. And it's not, it is complicated, absolutely, but in certain other areas it's not complicated. We're seeing genocide, we're seeing very, very typical colonial patterns of restricting movement, rationing, starvation in the long run. So do not come at me with your it's complicated story. That is the over-intellectualization fallacy, right? The fourth one is the false premise. Who read the false premise? Anybody read false premise?
I think it's us.
It's you? Okay. What was it? Oh, this is again one of my favorites. It's the
retouching like the people who want to attach the Jewish cause.
exactly. Yeah,
The white supremacy cause.
exactly. So when you conflate Jewish white supremacy with Judaism, and you say, "I'm afraid as a Jew to walk in the streets." You've seen this so much these days, right? And it's a false premise, because what it does is that it's an appeal to emotions, an appeal to a feeling of sense of vulnerability. It wants to evoke a certain feeling. You're appealing to the emotions as you're presenting yourself as the oppressed, which is, you're doing so while, people are doing, the people in Israel are committing mass suffering. So that's why it's hypocritical. That's the thing. You can say, "I'm sorry, but this is an appeal to emotions fallacy. I'm disputing land and power." You're carrying a false premise that I'm attacking your Judaism. I'm criticizing your white supremacy. This is not about religion, but systemic dispossession. You're appealing to emotions as you're presenting yourself as the oppressed in this moment. Now the other one and the last one is false dichotomy. Who read false dichotomy?
Us
Okay, what was it about?
instrumentalizing Jewish trauma, like
Yes.
victimhood as a refuge.
Yes, instrumentalizing Jewish trauma and victimhood. Excellent. You are either a vulnerable Jewish, traumatized, correctly, rightly, systematically traumatized, or you need to be oppressor because you were vulnerable. This is a false dichotomy, and it doesn't have to be like that. And I think she mentions rightly that you can be a Jewish person that is fighting for liberation. You don't have to be a Jewish person that is either, this or that. So there are no false dichotomies here. There are a lot of shades in between. Added to this because I think it's very important, and you can see it amongst Iranians very often. Waving the bloody shirts, which is such a complex story. Every time I read about it, I don't get it. It's about the white supremacy culture in the US, but one day I will get it, but I'll share what I know now with you. It can be interpreted as someone whose rhetoric usually recalls violent incidents in a very callous way for the purpose of scoring cheap political points and exploiting tragedies for political purposes. So you see Iranians come to you with like the picture of the people who have been killed in the protests. Look at this, why aren't you worried about this? This is waving the bloody shirt. It's especially they target other Iranians in the diaspora who say, "You're fighting for Palestine, what about, the Iranian dissidents?" There is no dichotomy between the two, there's no conflict, but this is waving the bloody shirt. It's a very anti-abolitionist right-wing attitude. It was meant to discourage black voters from actually voting, and it's continued in the right-wing circles to dissuade you and sort of like not participate. And it's very tough to go through it. When someone says, "How can you ignore the blood of Mika or Max?" I'm like, we're not ignoring that, but you are appealing to the waving of the bloody t-shirt fallacy. You are not doing this, you're not helping them. If you were concerned about their lives, you would be against the sanctions that US imposes and all the instabilities that follows afterwards. So you're doing here, you're waving the bloody shirt to score cheap political points. You are also not caring about the victims here. Calling of violent and sad incidents for your own purpose. So that's one of my favorites. So this is it. That's the end of the 5 fallacies that I wanted you to know for the teaching. And I have one page that I want to read to you, actually 2 pages. And that's it. I'll let you leave and go to the General Assembly. I put in the abstract that why would someone from the global south, like Iran, proudly become a provocateur? in Palestinian protests? Why would someone, instead of becoming an ally, they would come and say, hey, shame on you that you're looking at, Palestinians in Gaza and you're not looking at Iranians, right? Why would that happen? If they're trained to be this, then they're trained, potentially paid, and they're trained and paid. It's a different story. But chances are that they're not, especially in the case of Iran and Iranians. I always tell everybody that don't forget, living under local authoritarianism and not having the proverbial liberal freedoms is not easy. It's not pleasant. It's very difficult, right? No one should deny that. There's no doubt about that. Also, people's knowledges, their dispositions, their affinities and aversions are the constructs of their environment, as well as the mode of injustice they've been grappling with. So there's no question that we come from two different worlds. If they're not trained provocateurs, they're like, Nassim, how can you not see that? Sometimes it's genuine, I understand. I was one of them myself. So the position is understandable, and the environmental factors should be taken into account. However, for the ones who are living here, it is our responsibility and their responsibility to become familiar with the less visible and more structural forms of injustices as well, not just local, but colonialism, cognitive imperialism, the problems with wanting to become white, the problems of aspiring for democracy through asking the Western countries to help, to invade, to sanction, etc. These are problems that my community deals with, and we need to be aware that it takes patience. We're getting ready for the GA, It's also painful for me to admit that at some point of our lives, one of these ideas were appealing to us, right? We learned, we read, we were challenged by the insight that our readings and our good friends and professors provided us. We were all overthrowists. We wanted the government and the regime to go, and then we're like, oh my God, look, they're not doing this for our sake. They don't overthrow a regime for the sake of the people. They usually do it for the sake of their own interests. So, it takes a while. Then slowly, as you were mentioning, we adopted a different framework. So it takes a while. So in fact, so many members of the Iranian diaspora see the local power as the source of all the miseries. So they associate whatever government or ideology that is close to Iranian government as their enemies. Palestinians is one of them. And this is where I want to end. And I want to tell you, this is different, guys. People from the global south that do not share your feelings as anti-imperialist activists is different from fallacies. I think our role as activists is and should be very different. We need to patiently explain why. Because we're dealing with ignorance, we're not dealing with bad intentions here, right? So our role suddenly twists here and changes. Patiently explain why, in addition to fighting local injustices, it is important to see the global structures. And most importantly, what will happen if we do not take the global structures of injustice into account in our analysis and resistance. Hey, you're a Iranian person that you're saying, you guys care only about Palestine. Be careful, right? Or we want Canada to sanction Iran. We want Canada to help invade, whatever, like overthrow the regime and whatever. If we don't explain these and the consequences, we're left with half-baked ideas of the world, and we'll put our people in danger, our own people. The danger of bringing even more hardship than the authoritarianism on the ground. The hardship of war, being exposed to expansionism, exhaustion, attrition, sanctions, etc. So knowing how most of us, Iranians, are cognitive imperialists will help a lot. We see the world is often divided into two very particularly divided zones. One of them is the developed, free, secular, modern, Western world. This is the definition of cognitive imperialism. And the other one is the undeveloped, savage, barbaric, religiously fanatic, non-Western world, right? So we have this mentality in our heads. The authoritarianism on the ground doesn't help. So debunking the, to some extent, myth of the Western free world or the empire to people who are born and raised to believe and love the empire, right, is a key task. So that requires your patience, because people did that with me and it ended up being very beneficial for me. Debunking it slowly and with patience, clearly, and clearly is as important as combating imperialism itself. So make sure you know that this task is as important in value as actually combating imperialism. Otherwise, we have a lot of alienation. And I want to end on a surprising note. I find it surprising. I was reading Ilan Pappé's book, and I realized that this guy, my favorite, Ilan Pappé, and me, yours truly, we also both think that not debunking myths or spotting fallacies can be tremendously harmful. It's very interesting that in the middle of all the stuff that is going on, I'm calling for spotting the fallacies, making sure you know the myths, right? You're like, there is bloodshed on the streets, and I say, yes, but if we don't do that, this will continue on and on and on and go undisturbed, right? I want us to think about the word harm very carefully, because he says it's tremendously harmful if we don't look at the myths. I thought it's only the person who studies philosophy that is worried about the harm of fallacies. Turns out my favorite historian thinks the same. So spotting myths and fallacies that appear in the public domain as indisputable truths becomes an ethical task. And Pappé says that these myths are distortions, fabrications that can and must be refuted. He writes, I want to end on this note, the Zionist historical account of how the disputed land became the state of Israel is based on a cluster of myths that subtly cast doubt on Palestinians' moral right to the land, right? So if we don't spot the myths and the fallacies, this continues to cast doubt on the moral rights of the Palestinians. You see how it goes back into our responsibility to do that, which I find fascinating. This guy is amazing. Pappé says that these myths are distortions that can and must be refuted. Often the Western mainstream media and political elites accepts this side of myths as a given truth, as well as the justification for Israeli actions across the last 40 or so years. More often than not, the tacit acceptance of these myths serves as an explanation for Western governments' disinclination to interfere in any meaningful way in a conflict that has been going on since the nation's foundation. And he ends on a point that I find most amazing, coming from a historian that employs his rigorous research skills to create a better world. He says that he hopes that debunking these myths will prove a useful tool for activists who recognize that knowledge about Palestine is as necessary as commitment to the cause. There's nothing that can be added to these beautifully written words, and I will end on this with the hope of seeing one day a free Palestine. Thank you.